Everything tends to fall apart in a very specific way. Not slowly, not politely, not in a way that gives you time to prepare or make sense of it. It collapses all at once. The kind of collapse that feels almost personal, as if life waited for the exact moment you are already tired, and then decided to press harder. And what makes it worse is not just the chaos itself, it's the timing. It always happens right when you thought you were finally getting somewhere, right when you made a decision to do better, to be better, to take control again. And then suddenly, everything you thought was stabilizing begins to unravel, like it was never solid to begin with. The money gets tight, the relationship shifts, your confidence cracks, and something inside you starts asking a very dangerous question: why now? Most people answer that question the same way. They call it bad luck. They call it life being unfair. They tell themselves they chose the wrong path, made the wrong move, trusted the wrong instinct. And slowly, almost without realizing it, they retreat. They step back into what is familiar, what is predictable, what feels safe, even if it was slowly destroying them. But what if that interpretation is completely wrong? What if the collapse isn't happening because you failed, but because something deeper inside you actually moved? Because there is a pattern, quiet, brutal, and extremely consistent, that shows up right before real transformation, and almost nobody recognizes it while they're inside it. Here's how it begins. A decision, not a casual one, not the kind you make out of boredom or temporary motivation. The kind that forces you to confront parts of yourself you've been avoiding. Maybe you decide you're done living small. Maybe you decide to leave something that's been draining you for years. Maybe you finally admit that the way you've been thinking, behaving, or tolerating is no longer acceptable. There's clarity in that moment, a rare kind of clarity. It feels sharp, clean, almost powerful. For a brief period, everything seems aligned. And then, resistance. Not subtle resistance. Not manageable discomfort. Full force. Suddenly, things that were quiet become loud. Doubts that were distant become immediate. Problems that were manageable become overwhelming. And the person going through it begins to panic. Because from the outside it looks like everything is getting worse, not better. This is where almost everyone misreads the situation. Because they assume improvement should feel like relief. Like things opening up, easing, becoming lighter. But real change doesn't work like that. Real change disrupts. It destabilizes. It pulls on structures that have been holding your identity in place for years, sometimes decades. And those structures do not collapse quietly. Think about it like this. If you've been living inside a certain version of yourself for most of your life, your habits, your beliefs, your emotional reactions, that version didn't just appear randomly. It was built, layer by layer, reinforced through repetition, strengthened through experience, and most importantly, it was designed for survival, not growth. So when you decide to change, you are not just adding something new, you are threatening something old. And that old system does not interpret your decision as improvement, it interprets it as danger. That's why everything starts pushing back. That's why your mind suddenly floods with doubt. That's why your environment seems to tighten instead of expand. Because the version of you that has kept you safe up until now is fighting to remain in control. And it will use everything it has. Old fears, old habits, old emotional triggers, even people and situations that you thought you had outgrown, will reappear, almost perfectly timed, pulling you back toward who you used to be. Not because you're weak, but because the system is defending itself. It becomes dangerous, because if you don't understand what's happening, you will misinterpret all of it. You will look at the resistance and assume it means you're not ready. You will look at the chaos and assume it means you made a mistake. You will look at the difficulty and assume it means you should stop. And the moment you do that, the old version of you wins. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. You slip back into familiar patterns. You justify it. You tell yourself you'll try again later. And slowly, everything returns to how it was. Comfortable, predictable, unchanged. But here's the truth most people never realize. The resistance was not there to stop you. It was there to test whether your decision was real. Because a real decision changes behavior under pressure. Not when it's easy, not when it feels good, but when everything inside you is telling you to go back. That's the moment that defines whether transformation actually happens. And most people fail it, not because they lack strength, but because they never understood what the test was. They thought the chaos was the end of the process, when in reality, now, if you've made it this far, then something in you already recognizes this pattern. Not intellectually, but viscerally. You've felt it before. That moment where everything seemed to tighten at once, where the pressure increased instead of easing, where the version of you that wanted to move forward was suddenly surrounded by reasons to go back. And this is where the conversation has to become brutally honest. Because most people like the idea of change, but they are not prepared for the cost of it. They want the new life, but they don't want the phase where the old one collapses. They want clarity, but they don't want confusion. They want growth, but they don't want resistance. And those two things cannot be separated, because the collapse is not a side effect of transformation. It is the mechanism. Think about what actually has to happen for your life to change in a real, lasting way. Your thinking has to shift. Your emotional reactions have to evolve. Your standards have to rise. Your tolerance for what you once accepted has to decrease. And most importantly, your identity has to update. Not slightly, not temporarily, but fundamentally. An identity does not change in comfort. It changes under pressure, because pressure reveals what is actually stable and what was just being maintained by routine. That's why everything begins to feel unstable at the same time, because you are no longer unconsciously supporting the version of yourself that held it all together. You've interrupted the pattern, and once a pattern is interrupted, it either reforms or it breaks completely. That middle phase, the one you're probably in right now, is where things feel the most chaotic, because nothing is fully gone, but nothing feels fully aligned either. You're not who you used to be, but you're not yet who you're becoming. And that space in between is where most people quit. Not because they're incapable, but because it feels like nothing is working. It feels like you're losing more than you're gaining. It feels like you've destabilized your life without any clear reward. And in that moment, your mind will try to convince you of something very specific. It will tell you that going back is smarter, that returning to what was familiar is safer, that maybe you were fine before. But understand this clearly. That voice is not wisdom. It is memory. It is the echo of your old identity trying to reestablish control, because it knows something you don't fully realize yet. If you keep going, it cannot survive. That's why the resistance feels so intense, because something in you is actually dying, not physically, but psychologically. A version of you that has existed for years is losing its grip. And anything that has held power over you for that long does not disappear quietly. It creates noise. It creates doubt. It creates urgency. It tries to pull you back before you fully cross that invisible line. But here's the part that changes everything once you understand it. You are not meant to feel certain during this phase. You are not meant to feel confident. You are not meant to feel like everything is working. Because if you felt all of that, there would be no transformation. You would simply be repeating the familiar pattern under a different name. Real change feels like instability. It feels like questioning. It feels like walking forward without the emotional reassurance you've been trained to rely on. And that is exactly why so few people actually change. Because they mistake discomfort for failure. They interpret uncertainty as a sign to stop. And they abandon the process right before it begins to work. But if you can hold your position in this phase, if you can continue moving without needing immediate validation, that the collapse is not punishment, but restructuring, then something very subtle begins to happen. At first you won't notice it, because it doesn't arrive as a dramatic breakthrough. It arrives quietly, in small shifts. You respond differently in situations that used to trigger you. You tolerate less of what used to drain you. You begin to think in ways that feel unfamiliar, but stronger. And slowly, very slowly, your external reality starts to reorganize around that internal shift. Not because something magical happened, but because you are no longer reinforcing the patterns that kept your life the same. And once those patterns lose their support, they fall apart completely. That's when things begin to stabilize again. But this time, it's different. Because what you're building now is not based on survival. It's based on awareness. It's based on choice. It's based on a version of you that has actually been tested. And that kind of stability doesn't break the same way. That kind of stability holds. But only if you make it through this part. Only if you don't run when it gets uncomfortable. Only if you understand that the moment everything starts falling apart is not the moment you're losing control. It's the moment you're finally stepping into it. So if you're in that phase right now, where things feel uncertain, where everything seems to be shifting at once, where you're questioning whether this is even worth it, good. Stay there. Not passively, not helplessly, but consciously. Because that discomfort you're feeling, that pressure, that instability, not random. It's precise, it's targeted, it's necessary. It means something real is happening beneath the surface. And most importantly, it means you're closer than you think. If this made you see your situation differently, then don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who's going through that silent collapse right now. And if you're serious about understanding the deeper patterns behind your life, make sure you subscribe, because the next insight might be the one that changes everything.